Okay. Well, I mean, my thoughts. With me, is Simon Serfaty. My thoughts, I think, were more on the euro, although I was interested in what they said about NATO. But some of the demands for more courageous decisions, for following the example of Latvia, for being prepared to make cuts. One or two of the panelists said you can make cuts and stay popular. Um, are very relevant to where we are now, because the euro crisis seems to me to be right at a crunch, and if you don't have big, bold decisions taken by particularly Germany, but some other countries, the existence of the euro is at risk.
Absolutely. And I thought what struck me most in that conversation we just heard, outside of any specific issue, was the tone. There was a tone of confidence, not assertive, but sure of itself, reflective of the exceptional performance of the past couple of years for all of those states, including the three Baltic states. And frankly, I was thinking, this is not a tone we hear now in the older part of the EU, of Europe. It is as if the founding states of the EU had frankly aged poorly, and they are no longer capable of using those words, courage and vision and tenacity, and we've got to do it ourselves. And
Yes.
that's really what struck me. I don't hear that in Paris or in Berlin or even in London. And I don't think we would have heard this kind of a tone a few years back. So now the leadership
It's
for
here.
asserting a new vision of Europe come from the newer countries. And of course, the Prime Minister of Poland was especially forthcoming in that regard.
He was. Of course, his country's not in the euro, but it's been one of the best performers in Europe. And I think the only country in the European Union not to have experienced a recession, which I guess is one of the reasons why they feel more confident these days than they did. But I agree with your point, and it brought home to me two other thoughts. One is that I do detect, as part of the euro crisis, but not only as part of the euro crisis, as the economic development of Europe and the future shape of Europe generally, the beginnings of a north-south divide in Europe. That the north is in better economic shape, they are more confident, perhaps they're more interested in some of the security issues as well, and the south is sort of lagging behind. And this idea that there is a sort of gap that may be growing, I think is potentially quite worrying for the future of Europe.
Absolutely. For the first time, I think, we can say in good faith, as optimistic as I've been about the European construction over the past 40 years, that Europe is indeed at risk. And it is more than a north-south divide. It is what the French would call a divide tous azimuts. Take, for example, the reference that was made to this historically remarkable relationship between Germany, Poland, and France, leaving the UK out, and we might come back to that. But what is significant beyond the symbolism of that particular relationship at this time is the fact that this relationship would not have been able to achieve anything in Libya.
Yes.
Nothing at all. Because
Germany didn't agree.
Exactly, and Poland was not interested either.
No, that's true.
So that and the French alone, of course, would not have been able to do it. They always need a strong partner, and the strong partner in this case, and for anything military, has to be found in the UK. So in fact, it seems to me that there is a systemic crisis within the EU. It is a complete crisis, included, but going beyond the financial issue, and that is cause for concern. Really.
I agree with that, and I must say that to me, again, listening to what the Prime Minister said, but also what you just said about Libya, and we're seeing it with some other issues as well, the position of Germany is absolutely pivotal. I mean, Germany has become the key power. It's obviously the biggest power. It's the most important economic power. It's at the center of the euro. In the past, Germany has almost always put Europe at the top of its agenda. What it does is promote Europe, promote European integration, much more so really than France, and certainly more so than Britain. But I think in the last sort of year or two, that's maybe come into question. Is Germany putting Europe first or not?
Absolutely. You almost get the feeling, in a sense, that Germany dreams of alternatives to the EU, to that predicament. It has consumed the EU quite well over the past 50 years to rebuild itself, to rehabilitate itself, to reunify itself. But now that it must produce for the EU, it seems to be hesitating and surely taking its time at a time when there is no time to give on the euro as well as on other issues. On the budget issue, for example, which is also a focus of the Polish presidency, it will be quite interesting to see what position the Germans take. Will they continue to provide, in a sense, subsidies for that budget, or else will they pull away from past patterns of solidarity? There's something ironic about this situation because, in a sense, let's put it bluntly, Europe was built because of, and to an extent against Germany, to make sure that there would not be any resurrection of the old German state. Well, there is no resurrection of the old German state, but the organization that was built against it has now been taken over, and it is truly the big elephant in the room.
It is. And I think it's as you just put it, when I've discussed this issue with Germans, I mean, they make two comments. One is that the character of Angela Merkel, she is often slow to take decisions. She's a scientist, she likes to weigh up the evidence, and this has been one of the problems throughout the Euro crisis, that she always likes to decide late, and the markets want decisions early. So there's a problem about her character. But also sometimes I've heard Germans say, well, you criticize our behavior, but really we're behaving just the same way as France, Britain and other countries have behaved. Why shouldn't we behave like them? And one answer to that is that Europe in a way has succeeded because Germany has been prepared to make sacrifices for the sake of Europe that France and Britain in particular have not.
That's right. And everybody agrees that Germany now is a state like any other. There's no reason to view it any differently. This is a country that did more than tame its history. It just put its history aside and reinvented itself. And it's hard to think of state that succeeded as well as they did. But that being said, the argument you hear from your Germans is not that self-serving, obviously. The fact is, Mrs. Merkel, just as Mr. Schroeder before her, were and are the way they are because the Germans are the way they have become. And thus, when they say no to the use of force, when they say, let's think of ourselves first and see how we can continue to consume that prosperity on our behalf, etc., that's what we wanted the Germans to be.
Yes.
Good guys, that's what they are, and therefore their chancellors have no alternative. And in Washington, of course, we suffered a great deal from Schroeder because we could not understand that in the end it was not about Schroeder, it was about Germany.
Yes. The other thing I was going to say that I was left thinking about in relation particularly to the economic situation of the euro is that there is this division between those who are in the euro and those who are not. And of course we had Poland, Lithuania and Latvia, as well as the two countries that are in the euro, Estonia and Finland. Of course those countries say they want to join the euro, although that's some way off. But one outcome of this crisis looks at the moment as if it could be a bigger divide between those in the euro and those outside the euro, which concerns many people in Britain. Do you think that that's a fair thing to worry about for the future?
It is a fear, but if I think the Eurozone at 17 gets stuck or dwindles a bit, then in fact the EU itself will have been radically transformed.
Yes.
Europe has always evolved at multi-speed. But it was always assumed that at the end of the day there would be convergence.
Yes.
And as you say, in this particular case, if there was to be multi-speed in this particular context, then it would be on the assumption that there will not be convergence again.
Yes.
And that, I think, would transform the way in which Europe was envisioned and does raise concerns about a potential fragmentation
of the European family.
And you know, it's like those loving relationships. You miss it most after it ends.
Yes.
And all of the skeptics about the EU will find that the only thing worse than life in the EU is life without it. So the next couple of years will be decisive, I think, and they will be decisive in terms of whether the EU leaps forward toward what used to be called finality, that is to say the defining of new modalities of engagement. And then I think the Eurozone will be completed, or else might indeed dwindle. And from a U.S. standpoint, then this would create real problems. Because at the end of the day, our best allies on this side of the Atlantic, they are the most reliable. We're not going to develop a particular relationship with China, with Russia, with any. We don't know those guys. We know you. and losing that kind of special partnership with the totality of Europe, not one state at a time, but would be, from a U.S. standpoint, a very difficult thing to face.
And in that context, what do you feel about this question of defence spending, which came up more than once in the discussion? I mean, we know what Secretary Gates said in Brussels about the inadequacy of European spending on defence, and 2 or 3 of the prime ministers referred to the 2% pledge and said they hope to meet it. But it is also well known that most European members of NATO are nowhere near 2% and have no plans to get near 2%. Is this a problem for the United States?
Yeah, I think we're going to cut deeply, $500 billion over the next few years. But I'm not all that concerned about it. We spend a heck of a lot of money on defense on both sides of the Atlantic, be it said in passing. And Libya teaches us something, namely that we can do a regime change for $1 billion. We don't need 3,300 billion to do regime change the way we did it in Iraq. There is such a gap in the military capabilities available to the West on the one hand and to others on the other, that even a small investment of hard power in a particular situation can be sufficient, as was shown in the case of Libya, and as can be shown in other cases in the future. We had an aberration that took place in 2003, 2011, which had to do with those wars in Iraq and in Afghanistan from a U.S. standpoint. We're not going to go around and spend $3,000 billion in every little war with no end inside. So we can do more than we have with less than we'll be able to invest. To that extent, I'm much more interested in the Anglo-French attempt to work things out, because that is the focus of Europe's future in military and security terms. It is not between France and Germany. It is between France and the UK.
I agree with that, and I think that's looking quite promising. Although it has to be said that Libya did show, besides the positive side you said, it did seem to show that even France and Britain, the 2 most important military powers in Europe, can't really do anything without America.
That's right. But America and...
They're nice as they could, but they don't seem to be able to.
But I'm afraid that the 2010s will be very difficult.
Yes.
Unless the U.S. and the states of Europe as a union or its leading states cannot act together.
Yes.
And in a sense, Obama has hit something, has come across a way to do the world in the 2010s, which is this kind of complementarity of effort on the cheap and without tears. Nobody died on the Western side. That was well done.
Yeah,
and the U.S. did its part.
Yes.
The French, the British, and a few others as well, and it was done quickly. Now the hard part comes. But the hard part doesn't need to be done by the same.
Yes.
Now the Germans should come in and the Poles. Now we should go to G20 and tell G20, hey, are you going to put up some money for this thing? But unless we have America and Europe as an axis of stability in the 2010s, we're going to have a tough time. And remember, the 20th century was defined in the 1910s.
Yes, so it could be an important decade.
It is the decisive decade.
And just thinking about Europe and the US in that, I mean, the picture you portray would be reassuring, so long as we are sure that Europe and the US will always see the world in the same way. But they may not in every respect. I mean, I'm thinking particularly now of the Palestine issue. I mean, the Palestine issue, which comes up again at the United Nations, many European countries don't agree with the US on this. Do you think that the two sides of the Atlantic will continue to have the same interests in the Middle East, in North Africa, in the Arab world?
I think they look at the issues more closely together than with any other potential partner. At the peak, for example, of the bilateral differences between the US and France, you could tell yourself, hey, the differences between the US and France in terms of cultural affinities, goals, even vision of the world
Very small.
are lesser than, say, the differences between the US and Japan.
Yes.
And I think there is convergence there. The Middle East is a tough thing, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict even tougher. I think more coordination between the Americans and the Europeans should have focused on Israel. I don't understand why the Israelis would not have done a Sadat-like move with that resolution. It was for them to take the initiative and say, sure, we'll accept the Palestinian state, we'll vote for that resolution, and we'll negotiate.
It could have been smart politics.
Of course. But they haven't done, they have missed the smart opportunities as often as the Palestinians have.
Well, that's another issue, I suppose. Thanks very much.
Thank you.